Hey folks, Steve here with another Nations in Arms video. We're going to be looking at the 1810 year in this video for the Grand Campaign, the one that we've had a restart in 1809. So we did get our Wagram-like year of campaigning that saw the defeat of Austria once again. They are currently in a mandatory peace period, after which they will become a mandatory ally of France. As we transition to this new year, Prussia's mandatory peace has ended. They are now in a mandatory alliance with France and are now our good buddies for the French Empire. And we've gotten through production, and production is done. Major takeaways are that basically the Prussians are building up their forces under French direction. The Austrians are building nothing because technically the British player controls their production while they are neutral, and technically they are neutral, and they are basically dumping their money and they're not building much. This, in the long term, kind of keeps Austria from being a very great ally once they join France's mandatory alliance. Now, that might sound gamey, but if you caught the end, the last 10 minutes of the previous video, we did get into how diplomatic system in this game and the way if you're playing it as two-player, it does actually kind of work out, and it makes sense that you still end up with sort of historical outcomes. The carrots and sticks in the system are actually sufficient to keep things metered to where France doesn't become overpowered for having Prussia and Austria as allies, where really, realistically speaking, like they didn't want to be, they didn't want to be French allies, but they kind of had to be. So there's still enough in the system that supports that. So that's why you see pretty vacant Austria. They get some stuff from the Landwehr card, which gives free steps. And I don't think you can I don't think it makes sense to say like you don't get them. They still happen. I've interpreted it that way. So Austria got some detachments that the British let be built, but have otherwise not built anything and dumped their money. Uh, Otherwise, the Russians, which are also being built up by the British, are have built a new army near the border of Prussia, so that if Russia actually enters the war, they'll at least have a couple of armies good to go, with some Cossacks also built to kind of be a potent force when the time comes. Spain doing what it can to build up its forces to continue the Peninsular War. Britain likewise trying to build up some forces so that they have the capability to contest the uh, the the French forces. I kind of had to make a tough call to either build forces in Gibraltar or build forces in London, and I chose as Britain to build them in London with the idea that we need to kind of shut down the French Navy, but in the process, we can land a force somewhere and kind of keep them under threat. Where if we had built those forces in, say, Gibraltar, they could only fight in the Peninsular War. We still have the option to send them down there, but I want to clear the French fleets. That's really important right now. The British did end up building two new fleets. Technically, I also gave back the British two fleets. Um, because I had a French fleet that had a modifier of one that should not have been in the French force pool, but had been in many combats. And there were combats where the French had won. Like their victory, had that +1 not been there, would have kept some British fleets on the board. So I actually refunded the British those fleets. So it's a little more of a course correction than like cheating for the coalition. It was really, they shouldn't have lost those ships to begin with. So the French have taken some time and some money to build up their fleet with the expectation that they need to clear the empire from the seas, and then they can afford to drop their new British army of some steps somewhere to be a major inconvenience, maybe liberate some places or go to Spain. But we want the flexibility, and if I had built them just in Gibraltar, we would not have had that flexibility. I think Gibraltar is considered national territory, or at least it is colored like it is. So that's something I interpret that way. France is working on trying to build back its own forces. We're basically allocating Napoleon himself and the army of Italy to head into Spain to fight off the British and the Spanish and end the Peninsular War with great effect. So a lot of reinforcements going there, with the hope or expectation that if for some reason war breaks out with Russia before France is ready, Prussia can kind of, do the fighting. We are going to send Davout, the Iron Marshal, and the Army of Germany to pick up some units and basically have a strong French force in and around Magdeburg. So if we have to go against Russia, Davout is going to be the spearhead along with the Prussian forces. Um, and that should work pretty well. Like, I think in terms of just the force balance, it's in pretty good shape. I've already done diplomacy for this opening spring interface turn, or rather spring turn, and the only thing of significance occurred is that Sweden, now led by Bernadotte, which is always entertaining, you can read into that if you're not familiar, did actually get influenced to join the coalition camp from being neutral. So there is now an enemy to France in the north there, because Denmark is allied to uh, France. Like, there might be some fighting in Denmark, which we need to think about and decide. Do we try to where, how do we want to fight that out? It's not as though Sweden is super strong or anything, but it is now another thing we have to worry about. And wanting to consolidate the French forces as best as possible, we certainly want to continue to do that. So my overall strategy right now is get Napoleon and the army of Italy into Spain, shut Spain down before we ever go to Russia. I think that was a mistake Napoleon had made, that the whole Spanish thing hadn't been resolved when he went into Russia. I want to do that. I want to crush out Spain and Portugal, and then eventually get things moving back towards Russia, and realizing like that's crossing all of Europe, which means that we may not have our forces in the right spots to do the 1812. It might even get pushed back later than that, but you know what? I'm fine fighting in Russia in 1813 than fighting in the Palatinate in 1813, right? Like, so just depending on how things go, we're going to be on a slightly different historical track and timeline, but that should be expected in a grand campaign like this, where the butterfly effect means eventually we're just going to be kind of off on a different track. But I do want that decision made here that we need to focus on Spain. We're never going to have the continental system without Spain and Portugal. We need to shut that down, remove one of Britain's allies and a thorn in our side, secure a flank, and then we can think about fighting again in Eastern Europe. And the only problem could be, because the British have a +2 diplomatic modifier for Russia, that Britain brings in Russia before we're ready. So again, that's why Prussia has to be ready, and the French army of Germany needs to kind of be ready to play active defense against the Russians if it comes to that. The thing also, just before we move on, to the thing with mandatory alliances in a two-player game with diplomacy, is that there is always a danger and possibility that Britain could diplomatically influence Prussia as our mandatory ally, as France, to switch sides and join the coalition again. That's historically what happened. There's a couple different avenues for that to happen. There's a card that can just make that happen, and I've not seen the card come out yet. We'll see if it eventually does. That's something to watch out for. Otherwise, what Britain has to do is it needs to do it as a diplomatic action, which means they have to use their freebie, or they can spend money to try for it, which means they actually have to have money to do it. Basically, both France and Britain spent out all their money in production trying to get things put together. So Britain was willing to put that on the back burner this year, for now, and just hope for the freebie to succeed. But to succeed at pulling Prussia out of a mandatory alliance, you basically are going to have a diplomatic attempt. You can still spend money to get bonus modifiers, but I don't think you get the faction bonus. So if you look at the back of the Prussian chit, it has that B+1. That's British +1. You actually don't get that. You don't get that because the diplomatic attempt to break a mandatory alliance is against France for some weird reason. In the rulebook, it explicitly says that. So it's Britain, a diplomatic attempt against France, which means we don't get the +1 for Prussia. But if we have the money, we can buy up to a +2. And then you can also get a +1 if France suffered a major defeat in the last turn before the diplomatic phase that you're trying to do this in. So if France loses a big battle, that can give us a +1. So we could conceivably be up to a +3 if we had the money. And then for every full year that the mandatory alliance has been in effect, you get another +1. So since the mandatory alliance for Prussia has started in the spring of 1810, when we get to the spring of 1811, there will be a +1 to Britain's die roll. So you can imagine that, like, by 1813, we are almost certainly going to have there's a very high chance, if Britain wants to spend the money, to try to flip Prussia, and they will probably succeed. There's almost no avoiding it when you look at the bell curve of a 2d6, and then you add what could be 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 to that die roll. You're going to get over 12. You're going to get to 12 pretty easily on an average die roll. And because you could potentially do that multiple times in a year, that repeated attempts will eventually flip Prussia. Eventually, the same will go for Austria, though later. And technically, historically, Austria flipped on France like 6 months after Prussia did. So there again, in the game system, it will work out that we're going to see some pretty historical things happen. So this influences the need for France. Like, France is building Prussia up right now because we need a bulwark against Russia. But in future turns, France might not actually want to build up a huge Prussian army, because when that Prussian army flips, that's now an enemy. Again, and we discussed this at the end of last video, that's another way where you're going to get more historical force aggregation of armies that go into Russia. You're going to have all the French, you're going to have the Polish that are buddies with France, so they're they're better allies generally than Prussia or Austria. But Prussia only sent like 25,000 men. Austria sent like 30,000 or whatever. We might find in 1812, if we're going into Russia, that we only want 20,000 Prussians going. We might have used, the Prussian army that Prussia has now might be the only army that France lets them build, because we don't want a ally to become too powerful and then be a real problem later. So that's how, again, the interesting carrot and sticks that aren't necessarily explicit, but you discover them along the way. That is going to give, again, France that reason not to overbuild Prussia and only go into Russia or wherever they're going to go with a good-sized force, a force that can bleed step losses fighting the Russians, but are not going to be so big and powerful that France is going to be afraid of them, basically. When that mandatory alliance is broken, or when it happens, we're going to have to watch out, because when spring rolls around, Britain will then have Prussia build up as much as possible. We'll have Austria build up as much as possible. So the timing of all these things, when powers flip and whether or not they get a production cycle between when they flip, is actually super important. The timing of when these peace deals fall apart or come together or mandatory alliances trigger are super duper important, as it turns out. Anyway, I think we're ready to get started with the chit pulling. I am going to try to play a little bit faster, just so, with less things shown on camera. Just because it's faster that way. I can get through it faster if I'm not describing everything I'm doing as I'm playing through. But I'll try to show the significant stuff, and show the aftermath of every so many chits, because I really want to get spring, summer, fall, and winter all in this singular video, and will probably be about an hour, and I've already used like 14-15 minutes. So we'll get started with that. I think I need to put some chits into the cup, and we'll pull the first chit here in just a second. Okay, I wanted to see if maybe the coalition wanted to put their second naval chit in the spring, but I've decided against it. I think having them in summer really is the best thing to do. And I forgot to put a couple chits in the cup. Anyway, all right, so we'll pull the first chit for the turn, and we'll just get started from there. And we pull Coalition Land 3, which is actually That's a pretty good draw. It should mean that a lot of coalition forces can move. Um, Really, the only places that they can really focus on doing that is going to be uh, in Spain, I guess. So what we could see happen actually is some maneuvering to really put this guy out of supply and in deep trouble. This French force here, led by Moncey, and then otherwise, well, does Wellington have enough force to move forward? That's maybe the real question. But we can do a couple different types of things here to pressure the French. So certainly going to try something like that, and then we'll see what else happens. Okay, so let's talk about what's happened here. So we went through Coalition Land 3 chit, the neutral land chit, which didn't, Russia moved some stuff. Then the Empire Land 1, and then 2 naval chits. So with sort of the back and forth, maybe that you'd call it the first half of the turn, basically the Spanish tried to move forward and make some moves, but what ended up happening is the Spanish right force, tried to move through here and ended up getting. They were gonna get up to Saragossa, but Jourdan managed to push them back, and then this small force from Suchet came through here and managed to eliminate the Spanish force. Um, the battles were actually, could have been very close, but the French edged out a victory there, and they ended up running into retreat issues with the river. So, that's knocking the Spanish down a bit, which is really good. The guerrillas haven't been able to move yet, so everything has really just been kind of like consolidate. But if you really look at it, all that's really happened is that the French forces are kind of reclining back, just trying to eliminate and get stable still, which gives the initiative a bit to the coalition. Though they still control these forts, there's not enough force projection there yet. We are still moving Napoleon and the army of Napoleon with the Grand Army, and then the army of Italy is here as they're headed west. So they'll probably be able to operate in Spain during summer, or at least be like in and around there for summer. But it's taken them some time. They'll get to activate again at some point before the end of the turn, probably, and get, basically get closer to where they want to be. Um, in the north, there's just a lot of forces, or in the German theater, Davout and various forces are congregating slash moving north to be in a good position near Magdeburg. At least that's the plan. And then Bernadotte has taken the Swedish army into Copenhagen, and to contest it, the Danish army, or Danish force, I maybe should say, is moving to contest it. So we have these two forces right here, just to show there's Bernadotte and Bernstoff. So we'll see what comes out of that. Bernadotte did take Copenhagen and reactivated it, so he lost some of his force there, but provides the ability to start to chip away somewhere. Now, the really interesting thing for the two naval chits, and they came one right after the other, besides a winter quarters pool. So it's kind of interesting. The French Navy kind of swung up and got into the Celtic Sea and completely destroyed three British fleets, three British naval units in a very nasty set of die rolls, again, kind of out on the edges of the bell curve in favor of the French. Then they went into the Channel and forced the British to retreat. And so the French were sitting in here feeling pretty good, actually, having just destroyed an entire, British armada. But then the coalition naval chit came out, and the British managed to rearrange their naval forces such that they have a 3d6 plus 5, flotilla that managed to push the French out into the Bay of Biscay, and eventually just ran out of movement points, though the Swedish fleet is in the North Sea, just kind of helping to protect there. The coalition also tried to break out of these blockades down here, but those failed with some retreats. So, those modifiers are really critical. So I think like for the British, it's really important to have a flotilla of 3 ships with as many modifiers as possible. And really, you want that for each, because basically, what will probably happen is anytime you can get 3 ships on two, you're going to probably eliminate the fleet of 2 ships or the flotilla of 2 fleets, however you want to look at it, the naming conventions of the units. But if it's 3 on 2, you have a pretty decent chance of actually reducing that to a 1 or a 0. You kill off the fleet. Very rarely will you have 3 versus 3 and 3 ships get destroyed, but that's what we got, uh, amazingly, in the Celtic Sea, which is it's tough, man. When you're rolling box cars and then you're rolling snake eyes, that kind of stuff can happen. Um, so you really want to get, like, as the British, you want 3 ships with, like we have here. This is the best fleet they can have, or flotilla, of a ship with 1 bonus and then 2 ships with 2. 3d6 plus 5 is really hard to beat. The best French fleet here is 3d6 plus 4. So if this fleet wraps around and goes to the North Sea, they could certainly defeat this 3 fleet, with just a +1, right? Pretty reasonable that they can do that. So it's always tough. It's like the punch counter punch with the naval system in this game, where the very best fleet of either side can kind of go back and forth with each other, but that best fleet can probably start to shut down the other fleets. So I don't know. It's kind of, it still feels generally right in terms of what could potentially happen, because it's not like the French couldn't win naval battles. It's just once they got shut down, they were never coming back from it. And so far, the French have managed to do. They've been very lucky, and they were lucky in this campaign too, where they've managed to really hurt the British ability to operate. The British still have their newly built fleets that haven't quite left port yet, haven't needed to necessarily, but that option is there to replenish a force as needed. So kind of a tough one there, for the British, but at least they forced the French out of the channel. And then I just drew the Coalition Land 4 chit, which is, in my mind, sort of initiating the second half of this turn. I at least wanted to show what was going to go on. Wellington could make a move for Lyon. He may just do that. But there's very few coalition, 4 activation stacks. So he may be the only thing that moves, and then it's going to go right back to the French and the rest of the turn. So I'll probably show the end of spring here in a second after we play through the next few chits. I think the main thing is the coalition is just trying to get position and to continue to make Spain a hard time, where the French are really just moving units into the theater. So kind of a, not a super intense year 1810 is probably going to be, but it is, all shaping operations for further engagements to come. And if Russia joins in, then things could get very hectic. Okay, here we are at the beginning of summer 1810, and you can kind of see, like I said, there's a bit of a retraction all around. The later part of the last turn, French forces kind of chased some guerrillas away. There's still a fort under French control, but La Romana has taken this fortress here. Avoid trying to pronounce that. But, sort of pushing against the French forces here. And then this guy is actually come around and cut off this corps' supply. Now they're generally okay, but they are sitting out here with a siege. The steps are low enough that they can, avoid the worst of attrition rolls potentially, but this is something we are going to have to rectify one way or the other. The only saving grace here for the French, maybe, because again they're just holding, and Port-Suchet might be getting crunched by Wellington before long, is that Napoleon is coming down and the army of Italy is coming down, and really their goal is going to be a clean sweep around the edges of the country. So Napoleon will want to be pushing this way down to Lisbon, and then Eugene will be trying to come down and push through down to maybe Gibraltar, basically, and Cadiz. And if we can get, I think it's all the ports, we win the Liberation War, and of course, be screening in the middle just to maintain supply and to force the Spanish back and Portuguese back for that matter. So this really will be the highlight of the year of campaigning. Um, the French and the British are both broke, so there's no way to bring Russia into the war. I had to look into this because what's funny is I rolled dice. I'm like, okay, yeah, now Britain tries to influence Russia, and they rolled boxcars. I'm like, oh man, Russia's in the war. But no, for major powers, you do have to spend money to attempt. You don't get a freebie like you get with minor powers, and Britain is broke, so they don't have enough money to influence Russia. So Spain is ultimately the focus, with other forces on the board basically maneuvering to get into good shape. The French army in the north across the channel from the British, just making sure that the British can't do anything too sketchy. And then again, Davout moving north and is now in Saxony, where he can support Prussia or be, basically moving into maybe Poland, to just be in a good spot that if war breaks out with Russia in 1811, which is entirely possible, um, both the Prussians and the French will be in a position to contest against the Russians just fine. So that's at least the idea we have for ourselves. Um, and boy, the Austrians are just going to be really dead weight here for a long time. Even when they get into a mandatory alliance, the sandbagging of the Austrian production by the British is a problem. So anyway, this is the summer. We're gonna get rolling here and start pulling. We do have both the naval chits and the cup. This will be a long turn. I should also point out that the spring turn we finished up here a second ago was really long. The third time we pulled the winter quarters chit was the very last chit from the cup. So everything pretty much got played out as much as we could. And you can see we've left some things kind of up in the air. But the strategic goal: France, win the Liberation War, win the Peninsular War, and then prepare for eventual campaigns in the East for the British, the coalition. Continue to make Spain a tough one, and then see where else we can regain the initiative somehow, some way. But we got to hold the channel, which could still be a challenge. But we should see a lot of naval stuff this turn as well. Yeah. Okay, here we are partway through this summer. Just to show a couple of things, the French Navy is starting to suffer some attrition, and the British are actually getting the upper hand again. So the main French fleet is now at a DRM disadvantage against the best British fleet, which should mean that before long, the French fleet's probably going to get blockaded in a port somewhere in Spain. The French are now down at Cartagena, having taken Valencia, and are working to take that fort. The French are pushing the guerrillas back, and basically trying to kind of clear out the zone so they can continue to make progress and advance. And then the story remains the same kind of elsewhere, where we're really just moving to get into a good position. There's still only there's a couple of more chits left to play here in the summer. There's a coalition land chit, a French land chit, and then the last coalition land chit. There's not a whole lot that can be done now. It's really a question of what does Wellington try to do, if anything, at this point, to try to disrupt the French. And I don't think he's got the strength to do it other than to hold here at Lyon. Maybe if he can hold out the rest of the year and the French can't find a good way to advance, then the Spanish can rebuild. I should have had Wellington rebuild Lyon when they took it, but instead I didn't want to spend a step to do it. I should have just done it, because now it means it's really hard for him to advance and be in supply, and he can't really contest against Napoleon. So the effect of Napoleon coming into the region is having an effect, even if the army of Italy is basically doing a bang-up job of heading down and getting work done, basically. So we'll see the continued situation here play out the rest of the summer. Probably a whole lot will not change, and then we'll be looking at the autumn turn. Okay, yeah, we played through those last chits of summer, and they're just Wellington just can't get anywhere that would make a difference and still be in supply. So we're gonna hold off and maybe let the French come to us and figure out something better. At this point, Spain's not looking so good. Uh, if only because it's still going to be a little while before more guerrillas are built. And maybe I should have built more guerrillas than I did. I built a couple, a few, and maybe I should have just went heavy instead of building infantry and cavalry, which ultimately did get destroyed. Um, so maybe underutilization of the guerrillas is going to hurt me here, as the coalition and the French will be able to spread out and potentially, knock Spain out. I'm not sure. And by the way, I'm not sure what happens. Like how good it's going to be to have conquered Spain, because basically we're going to get 4 peace clauses. So it's a real question of like, what do we get out of it? Is there any? We probably make Spain join the continental system. Indemnities probably wouldn't be worth much. Maybe you try to go for a mandatory alliance, but I'm not sure that Spain would count for that. So I don't know. I'll have to look at the rules and double check. Like what's of value if we win the Liberation War? In a multiplayer game, you get extra victory points. Here, I'm not so sure. But of course, we're not done yet. The one thing I will point out is I played the Diet card, which actually sends one minor power to neutral status on a die roll, and that succeeded. So basically, Sweden is pushed back and is going to be neutral again. And now the Danish army is across the straits, in better control of the situation. So we'll save Bernadotte's for later, I guess. Rather have him be neutral at that point, because I just don't have a lot of good space to get units up there at the moment. And they were going to start impacting Danish production if I had not made them revert to neutral. So that's what I did. All right, well, we're going to go ahead and get, I guess, into the fall turn here in just a second. And we'll show the mid part. We'll do, yes, we will come back and show the middle of autumn, depending on how quickly autumn goes, and show kind of the status. But you can imagine most of the action is really going to be Spain-centric at this point. Okay, here we are at the end of autumn. This turn did end a little bit late, or I'm sorry, ended early due to drawing the winter quarters chit twice. We missed out on basically a couple of chits, but I don't think anybody would have done anything with them anyway. You can kind of see a couple of things. One, the primary supply line of the French really comes down like this, but we have finished coming through here. So here's where the Peninsular War is at. The French need to optionally go for Gibraltar, which would be a nice pickup if we can make it happen. But basically, what I should point out, there's a river here, but no bridge crossing. So there's sort of like this part of the map, it really comes from over here, and there's a little bit of a no man's land due to the rivers and the lack of crossings except for Lisbon and at Badajoz. So what really needs to happen is the French need to finish sieging Granada, finish that off, optionally go for Gibraltar. Otherwise, they're moving west and need to get to Lisbon, basically. And I guess they need to park somebody in Lagos, if I'm not mistaken. I have to double check. I think it's all ports, so we do have to take or hold Porto and this place here in Portugal. Napoleon's starting to press at Wellington, who keeps retreating, but that will come to a head eventually here in Galicia. Meanwhile, wanting to push further west. So you might look at the situation and go, oh, France is going to win the Peninsular War. But here's the thing. The French reoccupying all of these fortresses and everything else have lost a lot of their forces, have lost a lot of steps just getting through all of this stuff, and a little bit to attrition. Not too bad because I've been careful. Um, Now, the one hope would be Spain just doesn't have enough income to produce a lot. That's certainly going to be something um, that we would watch out for. But they can still try to do something. Um, they can still potentially try to do something. So there are going to be replenishments that the French armies will get, which will enable them to drive for here, get the supply links needed to push to Lisbon. And we don't technically need these fortresses, except for probably supply purposes. We would want to. So for the forces that are already on the board, it's going to be tough to get there. Any reinforcements that come in 1811 are going to start back here, and even if they just ran their way down, it's going to take some doing all of next year to even try to finish Spain and Portugal off. So I think it's still a very near run thing. I'm not sure what disasters could be called could what disasters could befall the French at this point. It is still conceivable that that could happen. Um, Entirely feasible that that could happen. So, the other significant thing that occurred is the British supremacy at sea has stabilized. The French fleets have been kicked back and forced to retreat. So the seas will belong to the British once more, which will make things harder for the French, if only because now the British really can drop a landing force somewhere and create a new distraction. They're probably not going to be able to do it this turn coming in the winter, but when they've had a chance to do production again, they can cement their naval supremacy once more and start looking at an expeditionary British force to either replenish Wellington and get him some reinforcements, or something else along those lines, or even maybe try to build some forces down here in Gibraltar and cause some havoc to these weakened French forces. All options here, but we still got to play winter. Winter could go by quickly, but that's the current state of things. Okay, here we are at the end of winter. It was a very short turn each side. Well, the coalition got 2 land chits, the French got 1, but it was a good one. It was the 1 chit, which means they could activate everything. I actually forgot to move a couple of these guys, but that's okay. I think that's fine there. So here's where we realized we didn't need the Grenada uh, fortress. We would instead try to besiege Gibraltar. We did not succeed. It's at a siege 1. So the question will be, can the Spanish try to build something in here? I'll have to double check. It is conceivable that they can, which could pose a major problem. Same thing over here with the Extremadura province. Badajoz remains unconquered. However, the French have taken La Coruña, occupy Porto, and Napoleon is heading down the coast. Really, it's good that winter came when it did, because the French would have likely have then been pushing down into this area of Spain, and nothing but a single Portuguese corps to stop him, and maybe this guerrilla. Now, you might be asking, um, but Steve, what happened to Wellington? Well, he was here, and Napoleon advanced and said, okay, well, we're going to have Wellington avoid combat again and just kind of figure out a way to maybe wrap around Napoleon later. When I rolled Snake Eyes for the avoid, so Napoleon caught him. Napoleon took a couple step losses in the combat, but he completely annihilated Wellington's army. So now, I mean, you can really see that much of Spain is under military occupation. The exception being some of Leon still has this fortress. Actually, Madeira has this fortress, and Andalusia has Granada, which I can swing back around and take later, I guess. Um, so generally, not looking super duper fantastic for these guys, and it could potentially continue to be um, a French success. But basically, we'll get a production turn, and the coalition has a chance to maybe get some guerrillas out there, maybe go full on guerrilla and just do everything we can to disrupt supply. The British can't build in Gibraltar now because it is considered besieged, which is a problem for them. And yeah, everywhere else is pretty quiet because there's just not much to do until Britain can get a new, they've got one force here to kind of defend. Now they can build a new peninsular army in Britain and think about landing it somewhere to be a nuisance. Where might be a tough call. Maybe in Brest, because now there's an opening here, and even there would be a mighty distraction for the French at this point before they can seal the deal. But anyway, that's it for 1810, guys. The Peninsular War is reaching a dramatic stage, with the British expunged, under siege, the Spanish and the Portuguese doing what they can to be a nuisance, but with limited effect now. Um, and Russia, the danger of Russia joining is present. I think Britain needs to save some money to try to get Russia in as well. At least, you think about it, like you're probably gonna want to have like 12 credits set aside, 12 money on the British side to attempt influencing Russia, with a bonus maybe, and really get them in to cause havoc. But we'll see. That's for the next video, guys, in 1811. When we get there, I've got to do some production and everything else. Production actually takes a little while because you got to clean up everything that died, kind of double check to see where everything's at. What can you build? Where can you build it? What can you send in as reinforcements? The armies need to be replenished, so you got to buy them some steps for that. So it takes a little bit, but we will come back in 1811 with more cards, uh, diplomacy having been done, and more efforts in Spain. So we'll see you in the next one, guys. Hope this one was interesting to see the advancing story of the conflict. We'll see what else happens. See you in the next one, guys. See ya.